Saïd, the Belgian violinist, was featured regularly on the concerts. The concert that Mahler conducted had Eugen Dalbert, the very famous pianist, as a soloist. They worked with conductors such as Richard Strauss, Felix Weingartner, Hans Richter, really all of the leading, mostly Germanic conductors of the time, and leading soloists ended up playing there. Mahler himself arrived in Antwerp on March 3rd, 1906, and he immediately, as was Mahler's habit, it is one of the very fascinating reads for if you want to get a glimpse into major composers' lives or major performers' lives, like the correspondence between Mahler and his wife Alma. All the letters have been published even in English translation. It's really a fascinating read to really get a glimpse into Mahler's day-to-day life and his thinking. I can highly recommend that. I can also highly recommend, if you haven't read them, the Berlioz memoirs. It's like used to be my favorite nightstand read. Hearing Berlioz or reading about Berlioz describing how he was a medical student and had to do like anatomy and how he described it. It's just fascinating. But anyway, off topic. Actually, we can go to the next slide. Mahler immediately wrote a letter to his wife in which he said how happy he was with the hotel in Antwerp. And actually, pretty rare for that day, he had his own private bathroom. And he had hot running water. So one of the great joys of his visit to Antwerp, actually, according to the letter, his greatest joy of the visit to Antwerp was the fact that he could take a hot bath, an hour-long hot bath, every day. And Mahler wrote to Alma saying that he really enjoyed his hour-long bath every day, but that he'd gladly go through his visit a lot more dirty if only the musicians would play more cleanly. Mahler was not all that happy with the orchestra. He was very unhappy with the performance. He felt the orchestra did not really perform up to the standards, his standards. In the case of Mahler, obviously he was working with what probably was, at that time, one of the top orchestras in Europe. And still to this day, obviously Vienna Philharmonic is still one of the top orchestras. And if you think about, Mahler working with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, New York Philharmonic after he was dismissed, you can see that, his standards were much higher than what he had in Antwerp. However, the concert was very well received. Part of my thesis, which I'm not going to go into because that's a whole other presentation by itself, is that most of the critics were very happy with the performance and with the concert overall. And the other very interesting aspect is that there was not a massive tradition in Belgium at that time of performing Mahler's works. Wagner, Richard Strauss were performed much more often. But that the kind of polemics that are always associated with the reception history of Mahler's music, absolute music versus program music, thank you. The concept of high music versus the banal. All of these topoi that we find in the general reception history of Mahler's music, not only in Vienna or even before, but Germany in general. We see the same thing when his music was performed in France. We see the same thing when his music was performed in the United States. These polemics also played out in the newspapers in Antwerp that reviewed the concert. So, like I said, we're not going to go into that. If you want more information about that, I'm more than happy to talk to you. But let's look now at where this Antwerp score fits into this editorial process. And before we do that, we have to kind of get an idea of how Mahler actually worked. What were his work habits? And here we find enormous consistency in Mahler's entire compositional career, all the way from Das Klagende Lied really the first work that put him on the map, with the exception of the piano quartet that he wrote when he was still, or right after, no, he was, I believe, still a student at the Conservatory in Vienna. But Das Klagenlied, the cantata, was really Mahler's first major large-scale orchestra, all the way going to Das Lied von der Erde and even 10th Symphony. We find that Mahler maintained the exact same work habits throughout his entire career. And I think, you know, that could be a very valuable lesson for, you know, I don't know if there's any budding composers in the room here. Yes? Yeah? Great. You know, it's like developing, you know, a great work ethic and a great work habit, and then sticking with it. I think something that's very important. Mahler's habits were that he would start with preliminary sketches, usually 2 to 4 lines, 4 staves. In these preliminary sketches, he would sketch out the main themes and some initial ideas for development. Once that was done, he would then expand it and write it out, still 2 to 4 stage scores, the full movement. Once he was happy with that, he would then go about orchestrating this reduced score. And once the orchestration was done, he would put it into a clean copy. The clean copy would include all of the markings in terms of dynamics, articulation, notations of rehearsal numbers, basically everything that's needed to come to a complete conducting score and stuff that can be copied into the parts for the performers. This clean copy would then, that was the one that would be sent to the publisher, that the publisher then would use as the score for engraving, to publish the score and to publish the parts. In the case of the 5th Symphony, only very few of these preliminary sketches, either these or full movement sketches, actually remain. Up until 1996, there's a few pages of music that are in the Vienna State Library. And then in 1996, a further few sketches from the Scherzo were discovered, and they're now in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. And that's it. And really what we have in terms of manuscript remainders of Fifth Symphony are 2 clean copies. One in the hand of Gustav Mahler himself, one in the hand of Alma Mahler. And what's interesting is that Alma Mahler, in her memoirs, talked about this clean copy. And she wrote, "I am copying day after day the score of his 5th Symphony, and we're having a competition to see who's quicker, he orchestrating or I copying, which he makes even harder on me by only writing out 1 line and me having to complete all the instruments in their respective keys." Oh. So what Alma Mahler is insinuating is that actually Mahler was kind of in this stage and she was doing this with only limited information. The fact is that both this clean copy in Mahler's handwriting and the clean copy in Alma's handwriting are preserved. And we know now for a fact that Alma was lying. I mean, it's not the first time she lied. When you read her memoirs and check it against a lot of other sources, you know, letters from other people, we know that she ended up embellishing, omitting, and you know, flat out massively manipulating a lot of the historical information about her relationship with Mahler and what his habits were. It doesn't really come as a surprise. It is, however, Alma's clean copy, which Mahler produced his own clean copy, and then he asked Alma to make a copy of that clean copy. It's that Alma's clean copy that was sent to C.F. Peters for publication. And that was also not that uncommon, because Mahler did not like to hand out his clean copies without actually having a copy himself, just in case it would get lost. And you can imagine, you know, the 8th Symphony, if you have to write it out by hand, and you have to copy it, and then that gets lost, and you have to do it all over again, how much work that is. You know, didn't have Finale and Sibelius in those days, so. Let's go to the next slide now. In October, in July 1903, Mahler started negotiating with C.F. Peters to get his Fifth Symphony published. Beginning of October 1903, an agreement was reached, and on the 14th of that month, Mahler ended up sending the clean copy, Alma's clean copy, to Peters for publication. And this was the publication of the study score. Now, is everybody familiar with what a study score is? Yes? No? Okay. Very interesting. The concept of a study score goes back way into the 19th century, where composers would actually have a study score printed before the premiere performance of the work, so that the listener, the audience, could study the composition in question before going to this premiere concert. And in general, for amateur musicians, professional musicians, music lovers, and music literacy in the 19th century was far greater than what it is nowadays. For people to be able to study a large symphonic work. That's also why so many of these symphonic works, including the Beethoven symphonies, Brahms symphonies, and a lot of concertis. Concertis, the same thing. Maybe a little bit different, but why we have piano transcriptions, so that before the phonograph existed, people could sit down at the piano at home, and pretty much every middle class, lower middle class, even household in the 19th century had a piano in their homes. Whole other, I'm going off on a tangent, which I like doing, so bear with me. But if you look, for example, especially on the east coast of New York, beginning of the 20th century, how many different piano makers there were. I mean, we're talking about 60 different brands, piano makers, that were making upright pianos, baby grands, for people to put in their homes. And this was for amateur musicians just to be able to make music, read through, let's say, a Beethoven symphony on a piano, and really get to know the work that way. It was also used why so much repertoire exists for piano, violin, piano, cello, trio. That repertoire was the entertainment repertoire of the 19th century as well. If you read Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, or the New Journal for Music, which was founded by Schumann, thank you, what you'll find is that very often Schumann would do an analysis of a composition, of a new composition, and write about this work before it was actually premiered, where Schumann had access to the score, this little study score, and would analyze the work and write about it intelligently, so that he would then invite people and say, like, look, it's a really good idea you go to this concert because this is a really good work for these and these and these reasons. Not because Joshua Bell is a star violinist and you should go see Joshua Bell. No, you didn't go for Joshua Bell. You would go for the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. But maybe you're familiar with those little yellow study scores, like Eulenburg editions, those little yellow things. That's an example of these study scores, which are still published nowadays. And with the Mahler symphonies, they also exist. There's actually this great little clip. I promise you I'll get back to that. But there's this great little clip of Abbado rehearsing Berlin Philharmonic in Mahler 9, which, my score of Mahler 9 is about this tall. You can actually get bigger ones too if you especially order them. But he's standing there with a study score. And there's a question that comes from this question, I can't remember. And he just picks up the score and he's looking at this little score. There's a score, like a single page is, like half, like an 8.5 by 11. And you've got this massive orchestration there, and he's just standing there looking at his score and puts it down, answers the question, and starts conducting again. But he had actually studied the Ninth Symphony from this tiny little study score, had memorized the whole thing pretty much, which is incredible in its own right. But yeah, usually they're not used for actually conducting, but for studying. Anyway, February 1904, Mahler sent a first set of corrections back to Peters after this study score was printed. And this, again, was very common. They print or they prepare an edition, and mistakes happen. Copyists make mistakes all the time. It still happens with Sibelius and Finale nowadays. How very often we get music with wrong notes in it, or wrong accidentals, or questionable markings. That you really have to either go back to a manuscript source or ask colleagues what the hell is going on. But Mahler sent back this first set of corrections to the publisher in February 1904. Got back the next version. March 1904, sent back the second set of corrections to Peters. And June 1904, a third and fourth set of corrections. Now, why is this important? Beginning of June, actually the world premiere was going to be given on 18th of October 1904 in Cologne by the Gerdsmith Orchestra. Mahler had sent, after this second set of corrections, a score and parts to Cologne for the orchestra in June to already start rehearsing the work for performance in October. And he would come in, Mahler would then come in October himself to conduct the world premiere. After he had sent the score and parts to Cologne in June, he ended up adding a third and fourth set of corrections. September is when this was published. The problem, however, is that the editor at Peters, when finally, at the end of June, Mahler had decided that, yes, this is okay, this is my final version, you can go ahead and print this, that the editor had forgotten to include his third set of corrections. So when the study score was published in September 1904, it was already published with mistakes in it. With a set of corrections, this third set of corrections, omitted from the study score. You can already start seeing how complicated now this process becomes, especially knowing Mahler's work habits, meaning that after every single concert, Mahler would introduce changes into the score. 18th of October 1904, the world premiere happens, and on November 1904, Mahler sends an annotated study score to Peters for the publication of the conducting score and publication of the parts. And so this was the version that, the published version, that would be used for the performance in 1906 in Antwerp, except that Mahler ended up conducting several performances of the Fifth Symphony. In the meantime, he actually ended up rehearsing this a couple more times with the Vienna Opera Orchestra. And each time, he ended up adding some changes into the score, which he then also published into the parts. Let's go to the next slide. Sander Wilkins, when he did his research and basically came up with the critical edition in 1989, had the following annotated scores available to him. First of all, there is what we now know as the Bruno Walter study score, which is this miniature score that Mahler had sent to Peters with his annotations, and from which the original score, conducting score, and set of parts were created. It is clear when studying this score that Bruno Walter actually used this score to conduct himself, because in this study score we find a number of alterations that go beyond the initial ones, and we also find conducting markings. Conducting markings usually of the kind, where you have a big score in front of you, and somewhere in the woodwork somebody comes in, in like some kind of colored pencil, you indicate right in front of it, and you write OB for oboe or FL for flute in the English language. Just like a memorization technique, so when you just glance down at the score and you see a red FL on the page, that you know, oh, it's the flute that I need to cue. So you don't cue the clarinet, who then looks at you with bewilderment. I don't have anything in my part. So that's the first score. The second score is the Wilhelm Mengelberg conducting score. So this is the large score. And Mengelberg was, at the time, music director of the Concertgebouw Orchestra, the very famous orchestra in Amsterdam. At the time, also one of the top orchestras, and still today, one of the top orchestras in Europe. And Mengelberg and Mahler were actually very close friends. And Mengelberg was one of the big proponents and supporters of Mahler's music. He ended up programming a lot of Mahler's symphonies, also after Mahler's death. And in 1921, 1921 or 1922, if I remember correctly, I think it was 1921 for the 10th anniversary of Mahler's death, did a huge Mahler festival where the Concertgebouw ended up performing all 9 of the Mahler symphonies over, I believe it was a 2-week period. 75 years later, the Concertgebouw did again, and where they invited not only, obviously not only the Concertgebouw, but the other 2 orchestras with whom Mahler had a close relationship. They didn't invite New York Phil, but they invited Vienna and Berlin as well, with some of the leading conductors, Mahler conductors of nowadays, of our time. And it was Bernard Haitink, Riccardo Muti, Claudio Abbado, Simon Rattle, and Ricardo Chailly, who at the time was music director of the Concertgebouw when this happened. Those 5 conductors also ended up doing all of the Mahler symphonies and song cycles at this concert. It is a really interesting documentary. It's called Conducting Mahler. It's available on DVD. I don't know, but you can probably get it through Netflix if you have the Netflix subscription where you can actually still get the disc. It's not available on streaming. But it's a really interesting documentary about these conductors conducting all these symphonies, and they talk about the symphonies, and they talk about Mahler and Mahler's work process as a conductor and as a composer. Really interesting if you want to find out a little bit more about it. Now, Wilhelm Mengelberg, in his conducting score, had a number of different types of markings. He would add, obviously, markings that Mahler would add in rehearsal. So we see a number of handwritten markings in Mengelberg's hand of additions that Mahler had done in rehearsal, copied into that. We find conducting markings, again, entrances and things like that. We find anecdotal quotes in Mengelberg's score, tempo markings in Mengelberg's score. These tempo markings are supposedly the markings for the time, length of a movement in which Mahler conducted one of those movements. Some of the things that Mahler said about the music, the one thing that we're not certain about is exactly where Mahler ends and Mengelberg starts. And then also this type of addition. And actually, let me quickly translate this for you. How I love you, you my son, I can't tell you with words. Only my longing can I bemoan to you, and my love and my wonne is my want or my ecstasy. Now, when we play, the Adagietto, these are actually words. It's a little poem that Mengelberg wrote to go along with the Adagietto, the very famous 4th movement. Let's see if you can hear it. Every note is a syllable. that would be a second stanza starting right now, with the melody repeats in the cello. If there's any singers out here, if I ever catch you singing this tune with this text, I'll kill you. But it was typical for Mengelberg. The poetic quality of this poem is not of the highest standards, but that was Mengelberg's romanticism and his admiration for Mahler. What actually is interesting about this is that it also does shed light on the fact that the Adagietto is a love poem, and it has nothing to do with death. And most of the time, the Adagietto, especially after Visconti made into a movie, the Thomas Mann novel Death in Venice, ever since then, the Adagietto has kind of become this, associated with death, where really it's a love poem that Mahler wrote for Alma. So in that sense, this Mengelberg poem shed some light on what the meaning of this Adagietto really was. It also has an interesting corollary to tempo. We know that Mengelberg wrote down in his score that Mahler took about a little bit less than 9 minutes to get through the Adagietto, which is basically roughly this tempo. This was according to Chicago and Schulte. Schulte usually takes pretty swift tempi. But this is really the tempo it should be at. So that actually it is a song, and at this tempo you can sing this. If you do like Bernstein, it takes about 14 minutes for this movement. As a singer, I wouldn't have to kill you, you would just die yourselves. You just get through the lines. Yeah. Next score, let's go to the next slide, please, is the Trieste score. Trieste, city in Italy. And this score was actually discovered by Sander Wilkins in 1988 and directly led him to undertake his doctoral dissertation on the annotated scores of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Now, Mahler had conducted, or was conducting, his Fifth Symphony on December 1st, 1905. And why is this important? At the same time, as he was preparing the materials for the concert in Trieste, he also prepared the materials that were sent to Antwerp and that were sent to Amsterdam. Right after his concert in Antwerp in March of 1906, Mahler traveled from Antwerp to Amsterdam and conducted his Fifth Symphony there with the Concertgebouw Orchestra. So this Trieste score is really important to kind of figure out, okay, where does the Antwerp score fit in? Did Mahler make changes to the Antwerp score after Trieste? Do some of those changes have an impact on the critical edition? And again, Sander Wilkins was not aware of the existence of the Antwerp score. Also, what is important to know about the score, and some of the work that Sander Wilkins did, is to establish Mahler's working habits in terms of what utensils he used for what purpose. And so we find, and what Sander Wilkins discovered, is that Mahler had a habit in his score to make any changes in black pencil first. And if he adopted those changes, a copyist would then write it into the score in red ink. Whatever was added in red ink to the score would go into the parts in black ink. Any kind of conducting markings that Mahler would make, or changes that Mahler would make during the rehearsal process, in rehearsal, he would do in blue pencil. So we have blue pencil for in-rehearsal work, black pencil for homework that he did, red ink for what the copyists did in the score, black ink for what the copyists would do into the parts. And knowing this is really of great importance to figure out what actually is going on with the Antwerp score. Then we have the Bruno Walter conducting score, which is another source for Sander Wilkins. Still with me? Yeah? The Bruno Walter conducting score, again, is the conducting score that Mahler himself used, so the large print format. Mahler himself used this score to conduct his Fifth Symphony. Bruno Walter used this score to conduct the Fifth Symphony. And the thing we don't know is exactly when Mahler ended up giving this score to Bruno Walter. And as you probably all know, Bruno Walter was kind of a student and protege of Mahler, for a big part of his life. Was after Mahler's death, one of his most important protagonists in this revival of Mahler's music. And long before Leonard Bernstein came on the scene, Bruno Walter ended up doing a number of recordings of Mahler symphonies as early as the 1930s, early 1930s. It's actually a fabulous recording out there from the early 30s with the Vienna Phil of the Ninth Symphony. Just phenomenal, and not nearly as sappy as some of the later recordings, especially from the 60s and 70s. And then we have the 1919 edition. In June of 1910, when Mahler was with the New York Philharmonic, residing in New York, he wanted to conduct his Fifth Symphony with the New York Philharmonic, and he inquired with Peters whether it would be possible, since so many changes had happened between the publication in 1904 and now we're 1910, 6 years later, so many changes had happened in the orchestration, that Mahler wanted the new edition published. So there was a back and forth, but then unfortunately what ended up happening was that Mahler passed away in May of 1911, and so he conducted a concert at the New York Phil, but what never came to fruition during his lifetime was his publication of a new, quote-unquote, final edition of the work. Alma Mahler ended up, at a later stage, after Mahler's death, sending, and she kept the discussion with Peters going, and she sent Mahler's conducting score and a set of parts to Peters to be used for a new edition. And Peters, at that time, decided that they were not going to invest the money in a new edition, but rather what they did was they used that score, Mahler's own score, with all of his annotations up until his death, everything that he had changed, and a set of parts as rental materials. And as so often happens with rental materials, is at a certain point, this conducting score never came back to Peters. So that was lost. So all that was left was a set of parts, a score that Bruno Walter had, this one, and an annotated study score. So in 1919, Rudolf Mengelberg, brother of Wilhelm, again inquired with Peters whether it would be possible to do a new edition of Mahler's Fifth Symphony score and parts, and he was actually willing to pay for it himself. Peters said, yes, we'll do that. But then again, a copyist, ended up including all of the annotations that Mahler had made based on the parts that he had, but forgot to introduce the annotations, the changes that Mahler had made from the original study score way back in 1904. So when this 1919 edition came out of the Fifth Symphony, the very early changes were not in there. So again, we were left with a set of score and parts that were of no use to performers. And so it took until 1989 and Sander Wilkens' work that Sander Wilkens finally said, here is the correct critical edition of the Mahler Fifth Symphony that was then subsequently published by C.F. Peters. And if you need to get a score, that's the one you should get. So let's now go to the Antwerp score, our next slide. I already talked a little bit about this. Red ink, black ink, blue or black pencil. Red ink for the score, black ink for the parts, blue pencil in rehearsal, black pencil at the desk. What we also need to know a little bit about are Mahler copyists. It was a profession back in the day, just like now people actually make a living or supplement income by setting, I don't know how to use those, kind of do, but I just did a number of transcriptions for a concert I'm doing in in Belgium next week. And I actually sent it to a friend of mine who's very close to Sibelius, and I paid him $200, and he set it to score and parts for me. You know, time it takes me, it's not worth doing that. Same thing with Mahler. I mean, not that I compare myself to Mahler, but Mahler actually, throughout his career, had 3 copyists. We don't know what their identities, you know, who they were. We just know them by K1, K2, and K3. And we know them because of their handwriting. And by the time of Mahler's 5th Symphony, Mahler was using K3 as the copyist. And we just know that from doing, and that's the work that Sander Wilkins did, among others, 2 other musicologists who did a lot of work in this sense. So we just know, based on handwriting, who this copyist was. From doing some research, Sander Wilkins decided that K3 was the copyist for the Trieste score and the Mengelberg score, the score that was sent to Amsterdam. And the Antwerp score was prepared right around the same time. So I ended up comparing the annotations from the Trieste and the Mengelberg score to those in the Antwerp score, and I found that K3 was also the one responsible for doing the bulk of the annotations in the Antwerp score, which makes sense since, you know, like I said, they were all done around the same time. In terms of Mahler's working habits, he would prepare these materials, and then he would send the score and parts to the local conductor for the local conductor to start rehearsing the orchestra. We know that this score that was in Antwerp was a score that Mahler had sent probably sometime in December of 1905 to Antwerp for Lodewijk Mortelmans, the music director of this orchestra in Antwerp, to start rehearsing. And when looking at the orchestral score, what I found was that there was a number of markings, conductor markings in that score that were Lodewijk Mortelmans's. Robert Becquet thought that they were actually Mahler's own hand, but I did a careful analysis of Mahler's handwriting and annotated scores, you know, with Mahler's annotations in it, and also Lodewijk Mortelmans, some other scores that I ended up pulling from, you know, from around that same time period. Actually, the scores that I pulled were from 1910 and 1911. Compositions by Lodewijk Mortelmans himself. He was actually a very fine composer, very much influenced by the late Germanic, very much influenced by Mahler's harmonic language as well. He wrote some really beautiful orchestral pieces, and I've conducted several of them. But so the markings in this Antwerp score were in the hand of Lodewijk Mortelmans, not as Robert Becquet had thought in the hand of Mahler in himself. In order to establish a correct chronology, we can go to the next slide, which is actually the tentative chronology that we came up with and that I was able to establish comparing red ink, black ink, blue pencil, black pencil to see how it all fit. I knew if Mahler wrote something in the score in blue pencil, it meant he did that in rehearsal. If it was in black pencil, he did that at home. If it was done in ink, it meant that he had sent it to the copyists. And from that fact, we know that at that point, Mahler had decided that he was going to keep those changes. I came up with the following chronology, that the Trieste score and the Antwerp score may have been around the same time, but for now I just placed the Antwerp score just slightly after Trieste since the concert was afterwards. But what I did find was there was a number of annotations done in the Trieste score in pencil that did not find their way in ink in the Antwerp score, meaning that Mahler had done some changes at this concert in December 1905 in Trieste, which also meant that he had sent the Antwerp score before December 1st, 1905 to Antwerp. And then we have the Mengelberg score, which has a number of the markings that were done in pencil in this score in ink in that one. So we know that the Mengelberg score came after that because Mahler had already fully adopted those changes. So Mahler, actually let's go to the next slide. So now we get into the meaty part. Becquet said that this gentleman by the name of Lodewijk de Vogt, who later on in life had decided that he was, had mentioned that he had helped Mahler with the editing process of the Fifth Symphony, and actually at one point he even called it recomposing of the Fifth Symphony. Robert Becquet's explanation of these quotes by Lodewijk de Vogt were that Lodewijk de Vogt had introduced those handwritten markings in the Antwerp score himself, and which also may explain some of the discrepancies in the chronology. However, I ended up doing, again, a handwriting analysis and found that none of those markings in the Antwerp score were in the hand of Lodewijk de Vogt, who was also a composer, and he did some conducting himself. So, again, I had some examples there. So, really, based on Lodewijk de Vogt's explanation that he had helped Mahler for the Antwerp concert, we have two possibilities. We know he did not mark anything into the Antwerp score, so either he updated the orchestral parts that were used for the concert, or he helped Mahler update his own personal score, the score that Mahler ended up subsequently taking to Amsterdam, and which later on found its way into the hands of Bruno Walter. It's curious because Lodewijk de Vogt, at the time of this concert, he was a member of the orchestra, was 17 years old. Now we know for a fact that Mahler would never let anyone touch his personal score and parts. Both Bruno Walter and Otto Klemperer, another great 20th century conductor who's also somewhat of a protege of Mahler, Otto Klemperer helped Mahler out preparing the orchestra for the world premiere of the 8th Symphony, and at times conducted the backstage brass ensemble for the 2nd Symphony. Otto Klemperer, with regards to the 8th Symphony that Mahler was rehearsing in Munich for the world premiere, indicated that after every single rehearsal, Mahler would himself collect every single part from every single musician's stand and grab a score and go home. And after each rehearsal, he would make changes into the score that he personally then would copy into the parts. And Klemperer and Bruno Walter, a number of other young conductors who were there, constantly were asking like, hey, Gustav, let us help you. And he's like, no, he would not let anyone touch. Now, if his closest confidants, like Bruno Walter and Otto Klemperer, were not allowed to write anything or touch any of those parts, it's highly unlikely that a 17-year-old, nobody that Mahler didn't know at all, would be allowed to be doing any of this kind of work. Let's go to the next slide, please. Number of discrepancies between score and parts that I discovered. This is from the third movement of the Bassoon line. This is actually a scan from the Antwerp copy. How much time do you have?
Anytime. You should wind down.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. This was printed. This is handwritten. This is actually the only 7 bars of Mahler's own handwriting that are found in the Antwerp score. Let's go to the next slide. Some discrepancies here between score and parts, where this was originally in ink, red ink added to the score, penciled out. The change was not made in the parts. Next slide. Here we see the word goed. This is Dutch. Mahler didn't speak Dutch. This was done by Lodewijk Mortelmans himself. He made this change. Probably based on him sitting in rehearsal with a score, this score that Mahler sent, and observing, and Mahler making that change in rehearsal, and saying like, okay, here we go, I'm going to write this in my score right now, so I know for future reference. Let's go on to the next slide. Now this is the most interesting slide. These are excerpts from a violin 2 part. Now all of the violin 2 parts were there. It was not just a single part, it was about 12 parts. The only part in blue pencil that had this crossed out, and 22 bars of rest instead of this music, these things rests instead of playing, this scratched out instead of playing. There was only one violin 2 part in which that was the case. Lodewijk de Vogt played second violin in the orchestra. So, let's go to the next slide. We know that Mortelmans did his annotations probably based on the fact that he was sitting in rehearsal. Now we also know a little bit about the Vogt. And I'm just going to read you a very quick, two quick excerpts of things that de Vogt said much later in his life. On his 75th birthday, de Vogt said, "In the orchestra, I learned how the foremost composers were very critical vis-à-vis their own compositions. I especially remember Mahler, who came to Antwerp to conduct his Fifth Symphony. I thus had an opportunity to assist him for several days with corrections he wanted to add to the already printed score. I learned a tremendous amount about orchestration in those few days." And 10 years later, for his 85th birthday, he said, "The most unforgettable experience was Mahler's visit. He came to Antwerp to conduct the premiere of his new Fifth Symphony. In rehearsal, the composer found new inspiration, thus necessitating continual changes and corrections to the score and parts. That job belonged to the 16-year-old de Vogt." He was actually 17 at the time, but so basically de Vogt was saying that he had helped Mahler extensively, and really what I ended up discovering by doing this analysis of handwriting and looking at all the parts is that the only thing that de Vogt did was he added into his own part that was on his stand, the materials that were sent to him prior to Mahler's arrival, the changes that Mahler then subsequently had made and took to Amsterdam with him. So Mahler had brought his own score and parts to Antwerp. Those were the ones that he put on the music stand, and de Vogt just copied those changes into his own personal violin two part. So what does this mean? I mean, this whole detective story that I did, and all this time that I spent writing my thesis for the critical edition of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Nothing.
Yeah.
We don't need to change anything in the critical edition of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. And really the only thing that came to light doing all of this work and having you sit here for an hour listening to me is that we know that de Vogt late in life vastly exaggerated his role into this whole editing process. Thank you.